can I ask you for your full name, and if you could spell it, that would be great.
Felicia Thomas, Felicia Thomas.
Okay, and I'm Suzanne Dennitz, and this is December 4th, 2012, and we're at Georgia State University for a Religious Life interview. Okay, first we're going to start with your childhood, which is, from when you were born, the earliest you can remember, up until about puberty, so it's probably about 12, 13. So what is your earliest memory concerning religion, and can you recall a specific moment or an event?
Let's see. I had young parents, and so my grandparents were more the spiritual type, so they went to church religiously. They, on both sides of my family, they were part of the AME church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm.
I had no concept of what that meant then. Still a little gray now as an adult. However, those so memories of going to church were with my grandparents on Sunday, and specifically participating in holiday events such as Easter and Christmas. Those were mainly the two huge holiday celebrations surrounding church. So mainly I went to church on Sundays, and we had Sunday school, and then we went to the main service that morning, and then that was it. And so let's see, as far as a memory, it would have to be I have a funny story. I was about, I guess, 10, so my cousin was about 8, and my maternal grandmother said that we had to participate in some sort of candle lighting ceremony at church. Had no concept of what it meant then, and still a little gray now. But I remember practicing on Saturday for this thing. And so we had to march at the aisles with the candelabras, and we were going to the altar to light these candles. We were supposed to turn opposite of your partner. And my cousin had another partner, and the partner turned towards her, and so her hair caught on fire. So, well, we put it out. Wow. She didn't lose that much hair.
Oh, gosh.
Just a pigtail. Wow. And then the next day was Sunday, and then we had this candle lighting ceremony. And as I look back on it, I think it surrounded some sort of like baptism. But with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, it's by this large organization that they kind of filter these rules and regulations of how things should operate. And as a kid growing up, you don't understand. You just do because the adults say this is what has been done for generations. So we just do. So I was taught to not necessarily question my religious traditions that I was practicing as a child.
Okay.
However, my paternal grandparents were more liberal thinkers, and so they taught me to not necessarily not follow all the rules, but if you have some questions, ask, and we can see if we can answer those questions for you. Now, when I was about 12, my grandparents, who were my dad's parents, who were attending church together, my grandfather decided that he no longer wanted to be a part of the AME church, and he left to become a Jehovah's Witness. So that was the great divide in the household. But they were still happily married, but when it came to their religious lifestyle, now I have an AME practicing grandmother and a Jehovah's Witness grandfather. And then my parents, who aren't going to church, but respecting their parents' wishes as far as what they chose to practice. So that's when I got introduced to the world of Jehovah's Witnesses and trying to understand that school of thought. And I respected their way of practicing religion. But I didn't like the fact that they didn't celebrate like holidays and birthdays and things like that. Although That was a factor for Jehovah's Witnesses, but because my grandfather had children and his grandchildren were always anticipating some sort of celebration, he just kind of, that was something that he didn't let stop him as far as his religion is concerned, because we were a little. But anyway, so that covers my adolescent years.
Well, let's go back and let's talk a little bit more about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a very segregated rural town in South Carolina called Summerton, South Carolina. The town was definitely divided, black and white. White on one side, black on the other side, and very little interaction with the races together.
Okay.
When there would be, I went to predominantly, we had segregated schools as well. Almost.
Really?
Yes.
What year was this?
This was in the 80s.
Okay.
And I mean segregated in the fact that we just the students never went to school together.
Okay.
Now, I went to a public school, and in the town there was a primary school that was from kindergarten to 2nd or 3rd grade, and then there was an elementary school that went from 4 through 6, and then the high school was 7th grade through 12th grade. Those were the public schools within this little town.
Okay.
And then you had a private all-white school that covered K through 12. So all the white kids went to that school, and all the black kids went to the public school.
All the white kids went to the private school.
Yes.
You don't remember there being any white children?
There was one, but he didn't last long.
Okay.
And I don't know why. And I don't know why, if it was, if they moved, because we never saw him again. But he was only there for like a semester.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Interesting. And was the AME church the main church that people attended in town, or were there a lot of different churches?
There were a handful of churches there, but the AME church dominated the town.
Okay.
There were only maybe, let's say 10 churches in the town. There were about 6 AME churches and about 4 Baptists.
Okay.
So, but you had more attendance at the AME churches.
Okay.
Now, both sets of my grandparents went to 2 different churches.
Okay.
So there was a smaller church on the outskirts of town that my paternal grandparents went to, and there was a larger church in town that my maternal grandparents went to.
Okay. Now, you said that as a child it was really just something you did because everybody else did. Did you have any kind of thoughts or questions about God or the universe or Jesus or something bigger? Did that ever concern you when you were a child? So that would be before adolescence.
Yes, it was. It wasn't until my grandfather became Jehovah's Witness.
Okay.
It was prior to that, I started questioning, why are we doing this type thing. I didn't really understand why we were doing the things that we were doing. And it wasn't until, but I kept that curiosity to myself. It wasn't until my grandfather became a Jehovah's Witness that I said, okay, there are definitely questions about God and Jesus and why there are different practices. Why is there another school of thought that I had never been introduced to before? And that's when I started, I should back up a little bit. Because I didn't grow up in my adolescent years intermingling with whites, I assumed that my religion was a black religion. Where they went to church was their white religion. And I didn't, and that's what I knew from 0 to like 10 or 11.
Okay.
And it wasn't until I was 12 when my grandfather became a Jehovah's Witness, and I said, oh, so black people practice other forms of religion or other schools of religion.
Okay.
Because of my environment, that was my way of thinking.
Were you exposed to ideas in the AME church about original sin, baptism, forgiveness of sins, salvation. Do you remember any of those ideas kind of hitting you, or
No.
nothing?
No. They would literally take one scripture, and it wouldn't be a scripture. It would be a line from a scripture, and you would be in church for 2 to 3 hours that day.
With that one line?
Yes, they can exaggerate and exacerbate one line from a scripture all day. So I had no concept of what religion or spirituality really meant.
So does that mean you kind of didn't put it in the whole context of like, okay.
Not at all.
What is the sentence they're talking about? I don't get it.
Not at all.
Now at home, and this is again before you were an adolescent, did you say prayers? Did you?
Yes.
Okay.
But there were prayers that were passed down, like the Our Father prayer. That was one we said all the time. The blessing of the food, that was something that we did before every meal, but not understanding where those prayers came from, but that they were just passed down. Okay. So for me, when I look back, it was more of a cultural thing to me.
Okay.
And less of a religious or spiritual thing. Like I kind of tied that all into one. It was more cultural than it was religion.
Interesting. Was there a lot of music?
Oh, yeah, tons of music. There were tons of music. And that was, I mean, the beginning of service, you said a prayer, you began Sunday school, and then right before the actual minister would speak or preach, then we had, 30 to 45 minutes of music. Okay. So that was our musical aspect of it, yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's cool. Were you ever in the choir?
Not until later on.
Okay. Now, were there any influential people in your childhood that were influential to you in a religious way? And this could be either like a real person, or it could be, even an imaginary figure, somebody you read about in a book, something like that.
My grandfather, my paternal grandfather.
He was the one, huh?
He was the one for so many reasons. Mainly because he was not a religious person in his early adult life. I believe he's 95 years old now, but from stories I remember him telling me that, I don't remember him saying that they went to church often. I think his grandmother did, because his mother died in her late 20s, early 30s of TB. And so he was raised by his maternal grandparents. And I don't remember hearing stories of him going to church all the time. And then definitely in his adult life, prior to marrying my grandmother, he didn't go to church a lot because he never mentioned it. But my grandmother always mentioned about going to church. That was something that she had done as a child, that she continued throughout her adult life. It wasn't until they got married that my grandfather started attending church with her. And then when they retired, they were living in New York, and then they moved to South Carolina. That's when he started attending church with her on a regular basis. Okay.
Now, how would you have identified yourself as a child, let's say 9 or 10 years old, if someone asked you what religion you were? What would you have said?
I would have said that I was a part of the AME church. Okay.
And I'm assuming here, I just want to make sure, did you have any contact with any people of other religions before your grandfather became a Jehovah's Witness when you were a child?
No.
Nothing?
No.
Were your teachers black as well in your school? Okay, and so did they attend your church as well?
It was a really, really small, tight-knit community. So you saw the same people at the grocery store, at school, at church. So it was a very small community. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, tell me a little bit more. We're going to start getting a little bit, just some more details about your adolescence. Do you know how your grandfather, or why, like what happened to make him switch to Jehovah's Witnesses?
He felt that, when we talked about this later on, he felt that there were disorganization. Like I said, the AME church has the huge church, or board of directors, if you will, that kind of gives the rules for all the other subsequent churches. And so the smaller churches didn't necessarily report meetings, accurate minutes from meetings and things like that they had to the larger church.
Okay.
So there was a lot of disorganization. There was a lot of deceit when it came to the financials that he didn't agree with.
Okay.
And he tried to see if he could bring some sort of structure, because he came from a structured background in his work career. So he tried to bring that into the AME church. And because he was an outsider in the community, he hadn't been there, maybe 10 years at this point after, moving there with my grandmother. He was almost considered like an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when he said he wanted the spirituality, but he couldn't really find a home anymore in the church he was attending with my grandmother. So that's when he decided to seek other venues as far as the church was concerned, or a spiritual home.
Okay. Now, was the were the Jehovah's Witnesses, was that an integrated situation?
Somewhat. There were a few. I never attended the hall with him. One of my younger cousins did. But we would still have discussions surrounding like family dinner or over the weekends when we would spend time with the grandparents, where it started to open my eyes to the world of the Jehovah's Witness and how they practice and what their beliefs were.
Okay. And did anything else happen, like let's say your adolescent and going up into your high school years? Were there any other changes in you of a religious or a spiritual nature? Did you keep attending church?
I did. It wasn't until after 12, going on 13, that we moved.
Okay.
My core family, my mom, dad, and my sister and I, we moved. So we moved from South Carolina to Savannah.
Mm-hmm.
And then because my grandparents they were the ones who kept us in church.
Right.
And because my parents were young parents and they didn't go to church, that's when we stopped going to church.
Okay.
So at the beginning, it was a little different for me. It was a little, I don't know. It was something I was like, okay, it's Sunday morning and I'm not going to church. This is different.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Did you miss it?
Yeah, I did. And then I didn't miss it anymore because I said, I could sleep in on Sunday.
Mm-hmm. And did your peer group at high school go to church? Most of them?
Some did. Some didn't. And now at this point, I went to an integrated school. But the majority of the students in my school, they were from all over the world because they had parents who were in the military.
Okay.
So they lived in different parts of the world.
Right.
So sometimes they weren't living in a place for very long, that they continued like a specific routine spiritual practice.
Okay.
So some of them attended church, and then there were ones who didn't go to church on a consistent basis, but they had spiritual practices, such as some of my friends who were Catholics.
Okay.
There were certain things that they were just accustomed to doing, being Catholics or practicing Catholicism at home.
Did you ever go to church with any of them? With any
I
of your
did.
friends?
In high school, I did. I was about 16 when I attended church with one of my friends, and she was Catholic. And I said, oh man, this is great. We're in here an hour, in and out, a couple of Hail Marys. And we're out of here. I was like, okay. I came home and I told my mom and dad, I think I want to be Catholic.
Really? What did
Yes.
they say?
Why? I said, well, I'm only in church for an hour. Well, do you really understand what that means? Which is the question my dad asked. I said, no, but, it's better than not going, I felt.
Mm-hmm.
And so I continued to go with my friend. And I was about 17, maybe between 17 and 18, when I decided there's something missing in my life, and I think it's spirituality, and I think it's church.
Okay.
So at that point, a friend of our family at the time invited my dad to ask his family if they wanted to attend church.
Mm-hmm.
My dad declined the invitation or something like that, but my mom said, I will go. And so she went by herself, and she says, she came back, she said, I had a great time, it was amazing, and I want the family to go together. So we said, okay. So we attended this church, which was predominantly white. and they were considered, I guess you would say, Pentecostal.
Okay.
And it was definitely new for me, coming from a segregated community where I primarily practiced African Methodist Episcopal, and then going to Catholic church for a couple of years, and then now I'm in a Pentecostal church, and then having a Jehovah's Witness grandfather. So I'm going to this Pentecostal, predominantly white church. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, this is different. And we had a female minister. That was something new as well.
Yeah.
Because I grew up and there were male ministers only. And you never saw anyone of authority in the church who were female growing up.
Yeah.
So that was also different for me. But I thought it was way cool. I was thinking, wow, this woman is powerful. She's the head of a church. I think this is amazing. I think I'll like it here. And that's when I joined the church. And we joined the church as a family. And then I joined the choir, and I was very active in that church.
Okay. Now, did you, there was something you said like when you were 16 or 17, you thought that there was something missing in your life.
Yes.
And you thought that was religion or spirituality. Can you kind of explain that a little bit? Like, what exactly were you feeling? It seems very young to be feeling like that. I don't know.
I think because there were several things that, let's see. My grandparents would often call us on the weekends. This is something that we did, and then we would go visit them every now and then. And one of the questions that was always asked was, "Oh, are you guys going to church?" And the answer would always be no. Mm-hmm. And then I think after still having conversations with my grandfather, and then meeting other Jehovah's Witnesses that came in our community on Saturday mornings to offer us the watchtower and to ask for salvation. And I was like, well, what is this all about? Everyone's asking about salvation. Everyone's asking about church. And that's the one thing I'm not doing, and I haven't done for quite some time now. Mm-hmm. Maybe the one thing in my life that's missing is some sort of spirituality. Because I did have a friend who was a devout Christian and strong in her faith even at 16 years old. And I said, well, maybe that's something that I need in my life. Mm-hmm. So I felt that was something that possibly was missing.
Okay. Yeah. Now, did you notice any differences? You talked about there was a female preacher. There's a lot of white people sitting in pews. Were there any differences in what they were teaching in the Pentecostal church as opposed to like AME?
Yes. I got a greater understanding of the scripture for the first time in my life. We didn't, as spiritual as my grandparents were, and as not so spiritual as my parents were, although my grandparents could articulate what the scripture was saying, I never fully got an understanding because they never kind of answered those questions. They would read the scriptures and says that it could be translated as meaning one thing, but we should follow it simply because the Bible says so. Okay. I didn't understand that the Bible were stories with a greater message, and I didn't get that until I was older. Okay. So attending that church when I was joining about 18 or 19 years old is when I got a greater understanding of what the scripture really meant. And at that time, I was encouraged to study and not just simply the person who's in spiritual authority in the church, not just take what they were saying for face value, but to study. And there were other reference manuals that I could use to understand the Bible. That was the first time that it seemed like my eyes were opening to what religion and spirituality was at that time.
Can you articulate, like, as a teenager when you first got into it, what your understanding was at that time? Like what kind of the most important part of the Bible was, or the most important lesson? I
had a really strong mother, and the dynamic of her relationship with my father was something that I had the fortunate to witness, because they were young teenage lovebirds, and they were married, and there was no marital discord, as far as no infidelity or anything like that. And my mother, when there would be disagreements with my father, she was very strong in her point of view. So with that, having that background, and then hearing there was a scripture that says something about the woman should be submissive to her husband. I had issues with that scripture. Right. I was thinking, I'm not listening to my husband. He's not my father. He's my husband. I should be his life partner. And I didn't understand what that scripture actually meant in the context. So how it was explained to me is that the wife should follow her husband, who's considered the head of the household, as he follows Christ. That Christ will guide the husband, and that he would make the best decision collectively for their family. And then that scripture meant something totally different. I was like, okay, well, then I could submit to someone who has my best interest at heart. Not saying that I was going to necessarily, because I felt like if I were to submit to a man, that I would be not strong as I saw my mother. And so that's, that was something that was very important. Like, that was the first lesson that I felt like I learned as far as understanding scripture and understanding the Bible in that context.
Oh, okay. And were there any significant religious figures when you were a teenager?
There were 2 men from Africa that my pastor at the time, they were her spiritual leaders, and we worked in conjunction with their ministries in Ghana, West Africa, doing a lot of outreach and a lot of mission work. And those were 2 those were the 2 strong spiritual leaders that had the biggest impact on me early on, when in my late teens, early 20s.
Okay. And why did they, was it something that they said? Was it because of what they were doing?
I believe it was, I think that it was because that they were from this really small village in West Africa, and they had become these large spiritual giants, so to speak. And they had forged a relationship with this coastal community in Savannah, and forged this really strong tie that had been at least 20 years. And it seemed like there were just a lifeline between our ministry and their ministry. But they were able to affect so many lives in just that one area in West Africa. I think that in itself was very powerful to me, and something that I respected and I garnered. So there wasn't necessarily anything that they said in particular, but it was just the kind of lifestyle that they led. That I held to high regard at that time.
Yeah. Did you go on any mission trips?
No, but I did a lot of community work, because at that time I was in college. Okay. So I was in college in Washington, D.C. So when there were community work, that would be during the summers, when we would go to some of the local projects, the housing communities, and we would do like a Saturday from 9 to 12 where we would have music and fun and games. We were also having like a service for people who didn't go to church. So we would have some sort of we would divide groups of the children from like small adolescents to teenagers, and then the adults would be some not really spiritual counseling, but just some spiritual one-on-one with different leaders in the church.
Okay. So you graduated high school in Savannah, and when you graduated from high school, how would you have identified yourself if someone asked you what religion you were?
I did not identify myself at that time.
At that time, you did not. So you hadn't joined.
I was about 19. I was 17 when I graduated high school, 18 to 19 when I joined the church. So it was after high school that I had already joined that.
Okay,
church.
so the end of high school, you really weren't you were just kind of going to Catholic church every once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So you moved to Washington D.C.
Mm-hmm.
and that's where you joined the Pentecostal church. Is that
No, I joined the Pentecostal church during one of the summers that I was home in Savannah.
Okay. And then when you went to Washington, D.C., what college did you go to?
Howard University.
Oh, okay. And so was there a Pentecostal church up there?
No, there was a chapel on campus that we often attended.
Okay. And so that's where that's where you were involved with, you said, a lot of social service work up there.
Yes. Primarily, I kept the lifeline between my church in Savannah that I joined and while I was away at college. So I would attend the chapel,
mm-hmm.
and they didn't necessarily, the spiritual leader didn't necessarily identify himself with a specific religion because there were so many people from different backgrounds.
Got it.
So, but it was just a way that on Sunday mornings for the students who wanted some sort of spirituality that they didn't necessarily have a church home within the city.
Okay.
We attended service on Sunday mornings at the chapel that was on campus.
Oh, okay. And did you, during your either high school or college years,
Mm-hmm.
have any associations with people that were not Christians in some form?
Yes, I had a friend in college who, her mother was a chemist. Her father was some sort of researcher. And her mother, prior to marrying her father, she practiced religion somewhat, not on a consistent basis. So she didn't grow up in a spiritual household. And she didn't identify herself with any sort of facet of religion. But because at that time, this is after I had already joined my mother's church, or the Pentecostal church, there were books and things like that prior to me leaving for school that I was given from members of my church as a gift to continue praying and reading reading scriptures and things like that. So they would often find me in my room reading the Bible or reading a spiritual book or writing in my journal. And she said that she was not practicing anything and she did not understand religion and she didn't necessarily believe in God. And then, so at that point, I felt like I needed to explain why I practiced the way I practiced and why I believed the way I believed. And she didn't necessarily have to agree with what I believed and how I practiced, but she did have to respect it. And that's all it required. So that was my first interaction with someone who didn't necessarily believe in God. Because everyone I was surrounded by, even my family and friends who didn't go to church and those that did go to church, they still respected some sort of higher power or God or Jesus or something like that. So that was the first time I ever come in contact with someone who didn't necessarily believe in a higher power or a spiritual being.
Right. Did that confuse you in any way?
It didn't confuse me because at that time I was very strong in what I believe and how I practice.
Okay.
Because, like I said before, the female minister was such a powerful figure for me at that time. There was nothing that could necessarily shake my faith or make me question what I was doing at the time as far as my spirituality was concerned.
Okay. And so you graduated from Howard? What did you degree in?
Administration of Justice. It's a pre-law degree. I thought I wanted to go to law school.
Okay. So you graduated, and when you graduated from college, if someone would have asked you what your religion was, what would you have said?
Pentecostal.
Pentecostal, okay. So you graduated from college, and that was in Washington, and we're in Atlanta. So what happened after that, just in your life?
let's see. In 2000, well, May 2001, after leaving school, my maternal grandmother died.
Oh.
And that had a big impact on my life. And she lived still in that small rural town in South Carolina. And she, my Pentecostal minister from Savannah, she, along with other members of the church who were black and white, they came down to this really small town to support us. Give us some sort of, emotional support. That meant a lot, you know. So early 20s, I'm still very active in my church. I moved back to Savannah after my grandmother died. I thought I was going to stay in Washington, ended up moving back to Savannah and just starting my life there, continuing to go to my church. And I think because my grandmother died and having that support from not only the minister but other spiritual leaders as well as members, I wanted to stay close to the church.
Okay.
So in my early 20s, that's when I was in the choir. I was a part of the women's group, the women's ministry, as well as the children's ministry. And it wasn't until my grandmother died May 2001, December 2001, everything changed. What changed was my minister married her first cousin and made the announcement in church. And it was very odd that December, I think it was the last December in last Sunday in December, and I didn't understand why there was some sort of tension in church that Sunday morning. And usually one difference I remember seeing at the Pentecostal church versus the AME church. At the AME church, you have the altar where the minister's podium, and then you have the chairs behind it.
Okay.
So the minister sits in the huge chair that looks like a throne, and then you have maybe your deacons that sit on either side of them, and sometimes other spiritual leaders as well. So you may have 3 or 5 chairs. At the Pentecostal church, excuse me, there weren't any chairs. There was just the stage, if you will, and the minister's podium. And then within the congregation, the minister sat with us. And that changed a lot of things for me as well, because it made me feel like the minister, the leader, was something that didn't sit high and look low on us, but sat with us, and we look high upon God. So that was something very different for me. So this particular day, when she made this announcement that she was married, there was just an uproar in church. And I went home that day and I said to my mom, how could she hurt her children? Because her children found out the day we did, when everyone else, something that I thought should be very personal that you deal with at home, we were living out this drama, excuse me, in church in front of everybody. That she had a huge flaw for me on that. And that changed the way I felt about my spiritual leader at the time.
Now, was this because it was her first cousin?
Mainly because of that, yes.
Okay.
Now, what happened after that is that there were a lot of people that left our church, and they were a part of a new ministry. There was a young African-American minister who had just come. He was living in Atlanta. He was a part of Creflo Dollar Ministries, which we know is a huge ministry here in Atlanta. And this person came from Creflo Dollar's church, moved to Savannah, and started this ministry. It started off very, very small with, I think, initially 9 members. And after the controversy at my Pentecostal church, there were a group of people that found out about this man's ministry, and they started going to his church. I visited the church within about 3 months of this controversy, so let's say around March.
Okay.
I enjoyed the music, the ministry, and it was not only it felt like home. It felt like I did when I was younger, where I went to predominantly African American church. Now, did I ever feel any prejudice or anything at the Pentecostal church, being that I was a minority? No, I didn't. I never felt that way. But at the new ministry, there it was predominantly African American, and maybe because I'm just familiar with my own people, so to speak, quote unquote. Maybe that's why I felt a sense of home. But the music was appealing, and not saying that I didn't like the music at the Pentecostal church, because I did. I was a part of the choir. Okay. But it was something fresh and new.
Yeah. So,
let's see. I think I visited the church maybe a couple of times, and it was around August of the following year, maybe 2002, that I decided I wanted to join the new ministry. Now, they consider themselves non-denominational. Okay. That was a term I had never heard before. What does this mean? So I started learning, trying to figure out what that meant. And then I liked what I found out, which basically meant we weren't following any particular school of thought. We weren't Baptist, we weren't Methodist, we weren't Catholic, we weren't Pentecostal. We're just all different, people, all different ethnicities were welcome to worship God in Jesus, of whom we believe. So, excuse me, it wasn't until my mother said, well, I believe that you have been a part of this ministry for some time now, that you should speak to the minister, the Pentecostal minister, to explain to her why you're leaving. And so I had this meeting, and I did not want to bring up the fact that she was marrying her cousin. I felt like I should bow out gracefully, saying that I appreciated the foundation that I was given, and that I felt like with what I learned from her, that I wanted to grow in another ministry. Then that's when everything changed, and she, the strong spiritual leader who was comforting in one of the most devastating times of my life, she turned on me like an enemy. And she said to me, this is all because of who I married. And it necessarily wasn't because of who she married, but really how the situation was handled that I did not like. The fact that the announcement was made in front of the entire congregation. It was when her children found out, and her grandchildren, and it was just very chaotic, and the whole entire church was in the uproar, and everyone was upset, and I was thinking, all because of you. And the way it was handled subsequently after that, I did not like anymore, and I saw her in a totally different light. And it was after that meeting, and she turned on me, and I tried to speak with her to see if we could come to some agree to disagree. She totally cut me off and ended the meeting abruptly, and I left her thinking that I'm glad I left. This is not how I'm supposed to feel. This person who was my spiritual leader for some time now she doesn't love me anymore like she said she did, and I felt almost broken at that time. Oh man. So later on that same day, she spoke with my mother in tears and said, I spoke with Felicia, and she told me that she was leaving. I'm just so hurt by that. And my mother, taking her side, I felt at the time, she said she was very upset when she talked to me. What did you guys talk about? What happened? Did you say something disrespectful? And I said, no, Mom, but right now I can't forgive her. So it took me about a month after I had joined the other church. And I met with her again, and I said, I wanted you to know that I forgive you for our meeting. And you know what she said? She says, I forgive you as well, but I can't forget. And she still was very harsh. At that point, I felt as if, are we dealing with the fact that you're hurt because I left? Or I questioned if it was a black and white thing.
Was she white? Okay.
And so I didn't feel comfortable with her anymore. And I felt like, well, I'm just going to go to, and I said this to myself, I'm going to go to my people where I feel like I'm treated with love all the time, regardless if we agree or disagree.
Yeah.
I just didn't feel that connection to her anymore. Because of the way we practice spirituality and religion in that church, it broke down all barriers of gender and race for me. But at that point, it brought those things back up.
Right.
So, yeah, that was a very weird time in my life.
Yeah, it sounds like it. A lot of upheaval. Wow. Now, all that happened in Savannah.
Yes.
And then what brought you to Atlanta?
Well, I had been in Savannah, let's say, I don't remember, 5, 6, 7 years at that point, I think. Maybe 6 years at that point. And I became very active in my inner non-denominational church as well. Part of the choir.
Did it have a name?
Branded Hearts Church International.
Branded? Okay.
And the logo for the church was a Bible, an open Bible with a heart sitting on top. So, and I think the phrase goes, "We're branding your heart with the Word, the Word of God." So I was very active in that church, part of the choir, the teenage ministry, the children's ministry, and anything, the women's ministry, and anything after that. Because of the relationship the minister had with Creflo Dollar Ministries, there were a lot of conferences and things like that we attended while in Savannah, and we would come to Atlanta. Then there was more controversy in the church, where there were a lot of extramarital affairs with, there were married leaders of the church, men, who were having affairs with women in the choir and other single women in church. Drama. Okay, so so then I said, maybe church is not where it's at. But I felt like at that point I learned that we are spirit beings housed in a body, and that we have this spiritual lifeline between God and our spirit. So I said, well, go ahead.
Let me just stop you right there. I normally don't do this. You said you learned that. Was that a new concept to you?
Yes. Okay,
and as far as, so we're spiritual bodies house spiritual things housed in a human body. And also, was the idea that you had a lifeline, was that a direct lifeline?
Yes.
So you didn't have to go through a minister?
Yes.
Was that a new concept for you?
Yes.
I normally don't put words in people's mouths, so I'm sorry.
No.
I just wanted to kind of get this clarified, because it definitely seems like there was a shift here. So
there was definitely a shift. If you think about where I grew up and the environment that I grew up in, and we practiced religion simply because someone said so.
Okay.
And we said these prayers simply because they were said. I remember them verbatim. There's something that you say all the time, like your ABCs. You know the song.
Right.
So that I was never taught that. I was taught that, we say our prayers at night, and we're saying those to God. But if there's something that you really want, you have to go through the minister to be counseled, to say, okay, this is what's going on in my life. I need you to pray with me, type thing. I was never taught at that early on that I am I have direct contact with God or my higher being. I never understood that until my early 20s. So with the second uproar of drama in the church, I decided I'm not doing church anymore, but I'm going to continue to practice my spirituality as I see fit. I come to Atlanta, and I said, there's so much drama in the church, I'm better off not going to church at all. So when I started working here in the religious studies department, then I started learning all about the less spiritual side of religion, and more about just like culture and practices and rituals and things like that. Things that I was never exposed to, definitely things that I wasn't given the liberty to explore.
Okay.
So now I'm like, I am open to everything.
Mm-hmm.
Then I befriended a grad student that was here that was Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned about Orthodox Islam. My concept of Islam was just the Nation of Islam, that they were all prejudiced and racist, that they hated white people, that white people were the devil, and that they prayed to Allah and things like that, but they stayed to themselves within this bubble. Did not understand, had no concept of Orthodox Islam. That's definitely different from the Nation.
Right.
So it was through my experience here and being an open book, not going to church necessarily, just opening myself to learn about spirituality and rituals and different facets of religion, that my practice now is totally different than it was 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe what your practice is now?
Every morning I say a prayer, and I'm not praying to a masculine God only. I pray to a feminine God, I pray to a masculine God, and I pray to the universe. And it's very simple and simplistic. It's not something that that gets me emotional in tears, but it definitely quiets the world around me.
Mm-hmm.
And I center myself, and I listen now rather than speak. I listen to whatever I feel that the spirit, the universe, the female God, male God is telling me
mm-hmm.
that I need to do for that day, or so just to have that quiet voice within myself, just to get me grounded and get me going for the day. And that's what I do every day. I do a daily prayer every day. I do follow what I would consider not traditional ministers. There are different, like I follow schools of thought like Deepak Chopra,
mm-hmm.
Iyanla Van Zandt. Those are people that I follow as far as having, definitely learning spirituality from just a universal aspect and not particular religion, whether it be Pentecostal, non-denominational, Methodist, or Baptist, or anything like that. I'm definitely following that type of spiritual practice,
mm-hmm.
not really identifying myself with a particular religion. Every now and then, when I feel like I want to congregate with people, there's a particular church that I often visit,
mm-hmm.
and it brings me back to when I was in my early to mid 20s, and it brings me back to those times of having a structured church
mm-hmm.
setting, and that's comforting right
mm-hmm.
now. But on a spiritual level, I feel like I'm more spiritual than I am religious now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all based on the cycle of what I went through growing up and now.
And do you miss, though? You said you kind of miss having a congregation?
At times. And that's why I visit the church. I feel like, to me, this is how I feel now, that I feel like if I join the church is when all the other drama's going to come.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I'm better off at home practicing my spirituality, saying my daily prayers and going about my day. And then thanking God and the universe for bringing me back home safely.
Oh, that's sweet. I like that. It's like one of those people that thinks that, their baseball team's going to lose if they wear their shirt wrong. Like that. It's like, no, I don't want to do that. Wow. Well, so now you say the prayers and sometimes go to church. Have you talked to your parents about this? Have you talked to your mom and dad?
Let me back up. So, when I moved to Atlanta, my dad had issues with some of the people in church, so he dropped off the roster as well, so he stopped going. But my mother continued membership. My mother was upset that I wasn't going to church. My mother was upset initially that I left the church. And my dad told my mother that your daughter is a grown person now, and she can make her own decisions as far as where she would like to worship. And that although you don't agree with it, you still should respect it. And it's a good thing, the fact that she's going to church. Now, because I was so involved in my churches in the past, it was frowned upon initially that when I moved to Atlanta, I was not going to church. And my mother felt as if the person I was dating at the time had some sort of influence on that, because he was not going to church. But I had to explain to her that we have different spiritual walks, and we are two different individuals. And his background was that he was going to church like me, 0 to 13. When he hit 13, he was teaching his peers Sunday school, and someone asked him a question he could not answer. And for him, that, was it opened doors for him as far as, I don't understand what I'm teaching. I'm just teaching what I've been taught to teach.
Right.
And I explained that to her, that his experience was not my experience, so that wasn't the reason why I wasn't going to church.
Right.
Now, because of that, when I would go back home to visit, a lot of my mother's friends, my dad's friends, were asking, "Oh, what church do you attend? What church are you a part of?" And I would often give the excuse, "I haven't found any place yet. And I said to myself, I don't want to disappoint these people. And then it all of a sudden hit me one day. Are you going to church for people? Are you practicing religion for people? But you have to understand that you are practicing this for yourself. And so the cloak of shame I took off.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't care what people thought anymore. And, what they say didn't affect me like it did before. Because it really hurt to say, I'm disappointing someone because I'm not a part of a church, and this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
And no, spirituality and church, they're two different things. And that's how I believe right now. So, yeah, in the beginning, my dad didn't give me such a hard time about it. But my mom did, because she felt like for the longest you were going to church and you were so involved, and now you're not anymore.
Is she still involved?
She is, and she's still a part of that church.
And does she still give you a hard time? No.
She respects what I am right now.
Oh, okay, great. Now, have you had any kinds of particularly powerful, important, metaphysical, meaningful, spiritual, or religious experiences that we haven't touched upon?
Gosh, let's see. My great-grandmother died in 2002, my great-grandmother.
Oh.
And I remember not believing in ghosts and all that other stuff. I remember laying in my bed shortly after she died, maybe 2 weeks or so. And I remember opening my eyes, and I felt as if I could see her. And I remember something in church someone in church, or I heard this from a spiritual leader that said, if a spirit being comes to you and you're afraid, that's not a good spirit. Or that's God would not place something before you that would immediately give you fear, because they said God is love. And I remember seeing this thing that was, looked like my great-grandmother. And I closed my eyes and I said, God, I know this is not you, because I'm scared and I should not fear my loved one. I opened my eyes and that thing was gone. And that was something that was, let's see. That was something that affected me a while after that, because I didn't understand, why did this happen? And then that's when I felt like I couldn't get those questions from church necessarily, because what would people think? And back then I really thought about a lot of external things, as far as how, what was the reflection I was giving to other people about the way I carried myself, the way I practiced, the way I spoke, the way I prayed, things like that. I was always concerned about what other people were thinking. That was one instance. There was another instance where within the Pentecostal church, they believe in the power of speaking in tongues.
Okay.
I was in my early 20s, and I remember they had an altar call, and they said if you would like the power to speak in tongues, where you can utter in the other language to God, where only He understands, that you come up to the altar to get this power. So, me, being very involved that I was at the time, I thought to myself, oh, I want that. And I went, and I said, I don't know what to do. And I remember this spiritual leader at the time, she spoke to him in my ear, and she said, just open your mouth, it will come. It will come. So I said, okay. So she placed her hand on my belly, and then she said, open your mouth. And for a moment, there was nothing. And then there was this blah, blah, blah that came out, and I was like, I don't understand what I'm saying. Then I practiced that for a very long time.
Like when you would go home, you would practice?
I would practice at home. I would do it at church when I felt the Spirit move me. But then now I don't do that anymore because I don't understand what it means. And I feel like if I'm praying for something and I'm praying to God and I don't understand what it means, but He's supposed to understand, I can't do it anymore. So I don't. But what was funny is that my paternal grandmother, who they don't do that in their church. I mean, they're very traditional and kind of everything is done methodically. She says, you speak in tongues now? And I said, oh, yes, grandmother, I do. And so she says, well, what are you saying? I said, well, that's for me and God. Then later on, when she realized that I wasn't attending church anymore, and she says, well, what happened to that speaking in tongues? Did you just forget the language? And I said, I guess I did because I don't do it anymore.
Oh, how funny.
So those were two things that happened that I'll never forget.
Yeah. Now, you said when the Spirit overcomes you, the Spirit moves you. Is that an emotional experience to you? Like,
yes.
Can you describe it?
I'll describe it and then I'll tell you what has changed about it.
Okay.
When I joined the non-denominational church, when I really started to practice that, it could be the music, and mainly it was surrounding music when that would happen. So there would be music playing, usually a very slow spiritual song and not one of the upbeat ones. So it will be one of those songs that lasts forever. But the minister would start speaking about various things that maybe someone was going through, whether it be loss of a job, loved one not being around, or something that you felt like you had been praying for, whether it could be anything. Healing from a disease or something like that. And it literally feels as if you have not seen your stomach. Like you're so upset that you literally have not seen your stomach, and you're overcome with all these emotions that they all come rushing from like the bottom of your belly up.
Wow.
And then you're crying profusely. You're just so overcome with emotion. And it's not necessarily a sorrowful emotion. It feels as if the room fills with what feels like this spiritual wave of love of God that you are yearning for, because you feel like only He knows your innermost deep secrets. So it feels like you have this wave of, you have this pit in your stomach that does not, and all this stuff is coming up from the pit of your stomach up through your chest out, and then you cry profusely, and when you open your mouth and you feel like you have nothing to say, then this muttering or battering or whatever comes out. And then the room around you feel as if this wave of these huge arms, and you want them to hug you so bad. Now, like I said, the room is filled with music, and then sometimes you have your minister kind of, how do I say, kind of guiding this atmosphere, if you will. And then after this kind of wave dies down, and there's like this calm that's coming over, you are tired. You're physically tired. You're physically drained because of all this emotion that's come out of you. So you almost have to sit still for a moment just to collect yourself and kind of regroup. Now, you do feel this like wave of change, like as if you're unstoppable. Like whatever that thing is that you want to happen that's good for you, you want that to happen. You believe it's going to happen at that time. And it's almost like when the residue wears off, which is usually the next day or two after that, sometimes if you don't kind of continue to believe as if you were in that moment, and if you're met with any adversity, you just forget that you were in that moment, and your faith is kind of questioned or shaken or something like that. I mean, you don't see the change come. You're almost waiting for that wave of emotion to happen again to believe again. Okay. Now, what's changed for me is that my dad would say, that's great that you had this spiritual, wave of emotion, and you feel really good about this particular thing, and you felt like you're going to change this about yourself if there was something that you were doing that was not favorable to God or to anyone, that didn't honor yourself. But are you really changed after this wave of emotion? After this experience, are you really changed? And it wasn't until the latter part of my tenure at the non-denominational church that question will always come up in the back of my mind. After that experience, my dad's question, are you really changed? And if I felt like I was going back to something that did not really honor myself, and I was waiting for the next wave of emotion to ask for forgiveness, to be forgiven by God, and to get a fresh start, I felt like if I was just in this really bad routine. And I said I just couldn't do that anymore. I could not do that anymore.
Oh. Wow. And so does anything like that happen now?
No.
Did anything like that happen when you were a child in the AME church?
No, definitely not. Absolutely not. There were times within the AME church where there were key people. You could set your watch by them. At this time, they are going to either shout in a dance, run around the church, or have this really long prayer. They were going to say this in that particular prayer. You could set your clock in your calendar by these people.
Really?
It was going to happen.
And it was the same people?
Same people every Sunday. So I didn't understand that some people have these waves of emotions. I just thought that God picks one from each church, and that's what happens. That's what happens. Those people are the ones that he gets to do the shout every Sunday in this particular church. They're the representatives for us. So that's what I believed.
So what do you I mean, that's really an amazing story, and that's you articulated that very, very well. And it's interesting to me that your father was the one that kind of asked you about that and made you think about it. What do you think about it now? Do you think that these people are being touched by God? I mean, do you have an explanation for it, or
understanding that I'm a spiritual being and that God and the universe, that's something spiritual. That's not physical that we can actually touch. I do believe that people have these experiences, but I also think it's just a wave of emotion. Simply just a wave of emotion. They're just overcome by their own spiritual guilt, if you will, or this is just my personal belief that although they have these wave of emotions, I feel like if you're just going back to your sins or your old ways. Not saying that you can't be forgiven, but why go through the task? What do I want to say? It's just physically draining to go through all of that, only to relive it every time because you feel guilty about something that you've done or you haven't done.
Right.
And I felt like I couldn't do that anymore.
Right.
And like I said, I believe that people have those experiences.
Yeah.
There's some that are changed, and they have that spiritual awakening, that experience, and it changes some for life. Mm-hmm. And then there's others, it becomes routine.
Right.
So to me, it's almost like 50-50. Some are changed and some are not. I respect them for what they do because I understand, because I had been there before. I choose not to do it anymore.
Right. What are, like right now, where you're at right now, what are the top 3 or 4 things, tenets is probably a bad word, but about your personal spirituality, things that you believe?
Let's see, what are the top things? I don't believe in a masculine God necessarily. I believe that my spiritual religious experience from childhood to my early 20s taught me that God was masculine only. And that leaders of the church are masculine only, and they should be regarded more than women. So I do pray to a female and male God. I also believe in universal law. I did not believe that before. I didn't really, that concept was not introduced to me at all. And I do believe more so now than I ever did before, the law of attraction, and that putting things, you want to attract those things. So there are certain things that I must practice in daily life, because every small thing that I don't realize affects the universe, it does, and then I'm attracting that back to me. So I try to be conscious always of how I speak, of how I act, how I behave to other people, because I want the universe to attract those good things back to me. Right. And I understand now that more so than anything, that I don't need an outside source to communicate with the universe and God. And that I guess the third thing would be that I don't have to necessarily wait for a spiritual wave of emotion to happen, that I could be a doer. And that those things, I can make things happen for me, then wait for it to happen to me. I can make it happen by doing something physically myself.
Yeah. Well, this is great. This is really good. We are going to kind of segue now, and we're going to talk a little bit about Georgia State.
Okay.
You came here to Georgia State and started working in 2007. Okay, so that's 5 years. Okay, what is your strongest memory of religion or spirituality associated with Georgia State?
I think I touched on this earlier when I said that I befriended a Muslim grad student and learned more about Orthodox Islam than I ever learned in my life. Okay. And taking that friendship, and I chose to understand that for this particular student in particular, their spirituality was cultural for them. To the point that they said that certain Middle Eastern Muslims don't treat her necessarily well because she's a black Muslim, and I didn't realize there was some sort of prejudice within that particular religion. Okay. I did not realize that at all. And then I started noticing that. And then I didn't realize it was more of a, looking at Islam from that aspect was more, she made it more cultural, okay. Period. So I attended a couple of functions, and I had a great respect for Orthodox Islam and what that means. And I did not understand what it meant before. And it was very taboo in my community and kind of how I grew up. And it was just something that you just steered away from. But I understand it now, and it's something that I hold high respect for. So it was. I don't believe that I would have gotten that. Those doors would not have been open had I not been working here at Georgia State.
Wow, interesting. How do you see yourself in comparison with other people at GSU in terms of religion? What similarities and differences have you found?
I believe I've met a couple of people that definitely think the way I thought when I was attending the non-denominational church. So I know their way of thinking. I understand their practices. But it is nice and refreshing to meet people who believe in a female deity as well as universal law. So I'm befriending people that have that school of thought as well. So I have very little interaction with people that, especially at Georgia State, that say they, kind of make it known that they attend church on a regular basis. But I like the fact that I'm surrounded by people with an open mind to other schools of thought and understand religion and spirituality and rituals and things like that. I'm glad that I had that interaction.
This is not about Georgia State, but I'm just really curious because you talked about the female deity. Is this a particular, do you actually, when you're saying your prayers, is there a somebody, a female somebody? Does she have, so she doesn't have a face, she's just a she? Okay. All right. I was just curious about that, if it was like Kuan Yin or something like that, or if it's just more of a feminine energy as opposed to.
Yes, because like I said before, that God was always given to me as a masculine being, and it wasn't until I decided to just kind of get away from church and understand spirituality versus just not necessarily religion. That's when I realized, okay, there were schools of thought, especially in African culture, that they believed in a female God and not necessarily a masculine God. It wasn't until, as my research says, that it wasn't until a lot of Christianity started infiltrating certain pockets of Africa that the masculine form of God was introduced to them.
Okay, I want you to think about I think we're going to answer that one. If someone were to ask you to describe the religious environment at Georgia State, what would you say?
Well, let's see. As far as I know, per se, there are a lot of Christians, since we are in the Bible Belt. And so I would say it's heavily Christian more than anything. Let's see. There's definitely a large Islamic community here that I've seen. And let's see. Those are the two that I can pick out from my experience, what I've seen. That I've come in contact with what to me seems like Christians as well as.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah.
Have you had any association with any Buddhists or any other Eastern religions, maybe other than Islam?
No. So that I know they're here on Georgia State's campus, but I've had very few interaction with them. Maybe one, but that's it.
Now, when you applied for the job here,
one Hindu.
One Hindu. When you applied for the job here, was it specifically for the religion department?
No.
You just applied
I applied. I actually started working in the psychology department, and then I interviewed for religious studies department, and then I got the call back from psychology before I started working here, and then I like this environment better.
Do you?
I do.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I like it here too. And let's see. So, just being here at Georgia State, so you feel like it's definitely kind of changed some of your attitudes about spirituality and religion? Yeah,
definitely. I think specifically being in this department has changed a lot. It's opened my eyes to so much. It's exposed me to things that I probably within my community would not necessarily explore. Just being in this department has done that.
Wow. And you feel okay about exploring everything then?
Absolutely. Now, before and growing up, no. Before, I was taught not to. This is what we believe. This is what we practice. Everything outside of that is definitely not of God necessarily. Not everything, but just most things.
Right.
Which is totally ignorant. And I'm comfortable in my own skin, so I understand and respect other schools of thought.
Right. Okay. And you don't have children, or do you?
No.
If you were to have children, do you ever think about how you would raise them? I just thought about that because you were talking about your childhood.
Oh, most definitely. Do I have an answer for that? No. I think that will come, when they arrive. But I think that I think that that's something, because I'm getting older, that I feel like I should think about what do I want my family legacy to be as far as spirituality is concerned. It's something that I have thought about, but I haven't come up with a concrete answer yet. I'm still exploring.
Still in process.
Yeah.
Well, are there any questions that you think that I've left out that would be important to my understanding of your spirituality? Anything else you would like to say?
No, none that I could think of. I think we covered everything.
Yeah, this is really good. Well, to end, I've just got some final demographic information.
Sure.
So what is your occupation?
Administrative coordinator here at Georgia State Religious Studies and Philosophy Department.
Okay. And where and when were you born?
You need the date, whole date? Okay, September 22nd, 1979 in Manning, South Carolina.
And how do you describe your ethnicity?
As my dad would say, human, but we had to check other or be African American.
Okay. And what is your educational background?
High school, and I graduated from Howard University in May 2001.
Okay. And what is your marital partnership status?
Single, non-married.
Okay. And you do not have any children?
No children.
And your current GSU affiliation?
Oh, the staff?
Right.
Yeah.
That's a trick question. And what is your current religious affiliation?
Well, I can't label that.
Okay. Great. Perfect. Well, thank you very much. This was really, really good. Really enjoyed it.